Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. There are a couple, maybe one seat up front. And for those on Zoom, thanks for joining as well. This is the East Bay DSA's Capital class, lecture number 1, and we're broadcasting here from the East Bay Democratic Socialists of America office in Oakland. And so thanks for the people here. Thanks for the people joining on Zoom. We've got a good group signed up, I think about actually like 80 people locally and a number of groups across the country, which is amazing. And hopefully many more to come. And so with that, I'm going to just jump into it. Why read Capital? Why now? So, number one reason, right? We need some sort of theory to understand the world around us. It's confusing. It's a mess. We need to get down into it. And we don't have to figure that out on our own. There's actually a long history of people who've tried to think through it and have thought through it. And we still live in a capitalist world. So most social problems connect back in some way to capitalism. Maybe it's not their only or their primary cause, but it is part of their conditions. And so reading Marx, reading Capital, are a sort of hand from the past, you could say, giving us some information, some insight into the social system under which we live. What does this class look like? Well, first, just some history.
Guys, I'll be back.
Okay, we got a little bit of someone coming in on Zoom. Cool. This class, it comes out of 2 Capital reading groups of the DSA's Communist Caucus. And so thank you to all those people who've contributed to this knowledge. It's not just me, and will hopefully be repeated many times in the future. So thanks for being part of the first big class version. The main part of the class is the weekly discussion group. So every week you'll meet with your group, you'll go through the syllabus readings, you'll discuss, you'll work through the ideas. That's the way to stay consistent reading the book and really be able to get through it. And so I'll mention this again at the end, but if you're having any problems with that, reach out to whoever told you about this, send us an email and we'll figure that out. There will also be 9 lectures, which this is number 1. And these are going to review the past readings. They're going to give some insight into what's coming up in the future. And they're also going to be available recorded. So if you don't come day of, thank you all for doing, they're going to be on YouTube and they're going to be, linked on the website for the class. So that's basically the structure. The weekly discussion groups are the core, and then there's also these lectures. We are reading the new edition, new translation of Capital. And so I think if you don't have it, you should get it. You can ask your group for a PDF if you'd prefer that. It's helpful for everyone to basically be just reading the same text. The page numbers are different, even the chapters are a bit different. So just referring to the same pages, the same chapters, and eventually the same words is really helpful. And then, if you need a PDF copy, ask your group. So recommendations for the discussion groups. I just wanted to go over a couple of these quickly because most of you will probably be meeting in the next week or 2. But the key thing here, and my experience, I think a lot of people's experience who've been in these groups, is you do have to be consistent if you want to get through the book. So missing 1, of course, that's fine. Even missing 2, if you have some big thing going on. If you start regularly missing, you're going to get behind. You're going to fall out of the context. It's really part of what helps you get through the book is these groups and being consistent in the groups. So I just encourage everyone to keep that in mind and try to sort of bring that extra energy to coming to the groups every week. It's important for us to sort of reproduce the groups ourselves. So at the end of each session, we're asking that people pick someone to send out reminders to everyone for the next one and to do facilitation. So just keep that in mind. And facilitation, it should be really easy. Even if you've never read it before, you can definitely do it. It's just taking some extra time that week to read the section of the text, maybe read some of the supplemental stuff, read the David Harvey for that week. And then just sort of presenting and being like, here's some questions, here's some passages I thought were most important. So just taking some time to make sure everyone's putting in their bit to keep the group going. The other piece of advice I have is sticking to the reading. I'll say I think this is a problem that comes up a lot in Capital because it's hard and there's a lot of material written about it. And so I'm just going to encourage people. Obviously, it's okay sometimes to bring in some of that stuff, But in general, you don't want to create a situation where like you're saying, here's what I know from this thing that I read that no one else has read, right? You want to stick to the text that you've all read, and try to like reference that and pull out quotes from that to talk and to make your arguments. So try not to sort of just bring in, I've read this book about 3 volumes and this is what I'm saying. Try to sort of stick to the text and stick to the reading. And then the last one is very explanatory. Just try to be kind and keep the vibes good. Okay. And my last warning is that, this is going to be recorded and put on YouTube. So this is really actually all you future watchers who are not in a discussion group. Warning, you got to read Marx with friends. Come on. Okay. That's it. So find some friends, create a group. We are going to have some advice and stuff on the website about how to do that, but it really will help you get through the book. And the website here is readingmarxiscapital.com. Okay. That's it for a little bit for all this class stuff. So, to jump into the lecture itself, again, why are we reading Capital? It's because there's just a mess of things. We're sort of overwhelmed in this political moment. I think a lot of people are feeling that way. I'll say I'm feeling that way. And there's a lot of people who are trying to think, how do I get beyond like all this stuff that's going on, to see through the headlines, to try to understand like, well, what is the underlying things that are happening? How can I understand what I'm seeing? How can I not, just feel sort of overwhelmed by the mess of the world around us? And I do think in addition to this sort of like overwhelming amount of sort of news and other things that are hitting us, you do have this sense among the core establishment sort of figures and people that there's something happening now, that something is transforming, that things are changing. So I have some quotes here. Francis Fukuyama, if any of you don't know, he's this sort of very famous social theorist who proclaimed the end of history. He's changed his tune. Now he's like, we've seen that at the moment, many of the integrated institutions have started to break down, and it's not clear what's going to replace it. So he's saying this. Same with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal editorial boards. If you look at the New York Times, right, the election of Donald Trump and news of political turmoil in many other democracies has created the impression that liberal democracy is everywhere in retreat in the face of authoritarians feeding on discontent over economic woes, rapid social change, mass migration, disinformation, and general malaise. And then the Wall Street Journal actually pulled a quote about the Biden side. The intensification of the American foreign policy agenda reflects a perception that the international political and economic system American presidents have labored to build since the time of Franklin Roosevelt has fallen into a deep crisis. Biden's team seems to grasp the gravity of this situation. So, we're in this mode not only where things are overwhelming, but where there's a general sense, even in the very depths of the establishment, that things are changing, and that something is going on, something's in crisis. And so that brings us to reading Capital, right? And I just want us to reflect that. Like, we're trying to understand this crazy world. We don't want to be stuck in the sludge, stuck in the weird postmodern swamp. We want to take a step back, get a hold of some theory, get a little bit of a better grasp of what's going on, and thus read Capital. And so with that, I'm going to jump into one of the first sections of reading for the first week, the 1867 Preface. And mostly just follow through that pretty closely. So a lot of the arguments here are straight out of that section of the book. So one of the first things Marx says in the preface, it's a warning. Beginnings are always the most difficult. He says, chapter 1's going to be hard. It's because to start something, to start a science, to start a sort of like basic theory is difficult. And so just keep that in mind. I put the picture here, God separating the light from the darkness, right? Like you're starting with these very fundamental things that are a little abstract. They're hard to see because there's nothing that, there's nothing you haven't started yet. There's nothing else to base it on. And so just keeping that in mind that chapter 1's going to be difficult, but we are going to move through it. There's going to be a lot of support. I also wanted to say that Marx develops his argument in layers. And so in a way, you can also think of it that way, right? Like this beginning is that core part, and it's hardest to make. Adding a layer on top gets a little easier. Once you have 10 or 15 layers, every layer you add is a little easier. So So we'll return to many of the concepts in Capital again and again, and each time we return, they're going to be seen from a new angle or take on a new depth. And to make this very specific, Chapter 1, Section 1, in some sense covers a whole bunch of the theory around the whole book. The rest of Chapter 1 actually sort of reviews that theory and adds new layers of depth to it, covers it, gives it a little more substance. And then 2 and 3 again redo that theory. So this first section that we're going to be reading is really going to set this foundation. And so with that, I think we're going to cover Chapter 1, Section 1 later in the lecture, but I'm going to go back to the preface itself. And Marx has this quote from the preface. He introduces some of the key terms that he uses in the book. And he says, the value form, which in its fully developed shape is the money form, has little content and is actually quite simple. Yet for more than 2,000 years, the human mind has failed to comprehend it, while much more complex forms that have much more content have been analyzed with at least some degree of success. And he does reference the idea of the cell, right? So he's saying, look, when we think of modern science, we understand everything from the ecosystem to the organism, the organs, the cells, and even deep in the intercellular level, we have these sort of incredible pictures that we can now create of what's going on. The amount of content that's covered in that is huge. Like the degree of analysis is huge. And in contrast, the value form, these things that we're going to start talking about, are actually much, much simpler. So he's giving you that information, but at the same time he's saying we failed to comprehend it. And the reason is we're talking about something that is abstract. It's like a social system. And so we can't just take a microscope and zoom in on it. And so to maybe make it concrete, right, he says a little bit later in the preface, microscopes and chemical reagents are of no help to us when we analyze economic forms. Our power of abstraction must do the work of both. And so I don't know, it helped me to sort of think, well, what if you did take a microscope and you zoomed in on American society and you picked some really small little view? You might see something not too different from this here, right? You might see a parking lot, a highway, a building that's on fire, some weird sexual thing that's going on. It's not quite clear what it is. That's not going to give you a picture of what actually is going on as a society, because we're using a microscope to try to zoom in. It's not actually getting us to the fundamentals, right? We actually need to use the power of abstraction. And so it is actually harder to study the cells of society, you could say, the value form, than to study these physical processes, which even though they're very complex and very difficult, we have these tools that help us like zoom in on them. We don't have the same sort of tools, and we have to use the way we think and the way we, our theory and our power of abstraction to replace them. And so one aspect of this that he mentions in the preface is that he sees individuals as personifications of social relations. And that just, means that the broader social relations are creating an environment within which these individuals are making decisions. These broader social relations are pushing people both to think and to act the way they do, and they're even forcing certain behaviors onto people. And so Marx, he's not starting with individual motivations or calculations. He's trying to think about these larger forces that push people to act how they do. And to make it just super concrete, right, he's not talking about an individual capitalist or employer or an individual landlord. He's not like, if I understand their internal dynamics, that'll help me understand the dynamics of labor struggle or housing struggle. So he's trying to sort of see these things as people, as personifications of these broader relations. Similarly, when we talk about this idea of abstraction, one of the questions is, what is the object of capital? What are we trying to understand when we read Capital? What is Marx trying to understand when he reads Capital? When he writes Capital, sorry. And there's two quotes in the preface that sort of get at that. The first, the capitalist mode of production and the relations of production and exchange that go with it. The second, the ultimate goal of this work is to reveal modern society's economic law of motion. And so what we're trying to see here is basically these sort of like abstract figures, theories of how society is working. right? That goes sort of underneath. It's the mode of production. It's the law of motion of the economic law of motion of society. And Marx, he's sitting, I have this picture here, in the Great British Library, writing mostly about England in the 1860s and thinking a lot about England and using a lot of data from England, but he's not trying to write a history of England in the 1860s or of capitalism in, the English 1860s. He's trying to use what he has in front of him to create this broader theory of a mode of production, of the relations of production, of the economic laws of motion. And so, I think that can be I'll just say, right? Like most of the things we read, people are talking about their immediate environment, and they're trying to intervene in that, and they're trying to do that. Marx will do some of it, but his ultimate goal is to sort of make this, this broader theory. I want to just sort of nail down on this point. So trying to think of what does it mean to understand capitalism as a social system or a mode of production? And I do think we can find an analogy in natural ecosystems and science. So when we think about natural ecosystems, science has already discovered laws of motion, like, for example, the predator-prey model, which if people aren't familiar with, I have sort of a quick and dirty version here, right? It's basically just that the prey population increases, causing the predator population to increase, meaning the prey population dies off, the predators are having a good time. Suddenly they're not having so good of a time. Their population starts going down. And it's this oscillating cycle. And you can see that even though in the model there's sort of a perfect representation of that, the real behavior definitely follows the model, but is not exact, right? So this is like an abstract law of motion that actually does explain how certain ecosystem dynamics work out. And we're trying to discover similar types of underlying laws and dynamics in capitalism. We're trying to know what makes it so powerful, what makes it so pervasive, what allowed it to stretch from England across the whole globe and still dominate our lives today. And so I was going to sort of pull this big quote from the preface, piece by piece, that sort of goes into some of these topics. Because he says, I'm trying to do this big thing, and I'm talking about England, but why is England a good place? He says, more than any other place, England serves to illustrate the theory being developed. But if, nevertheless, my German reader were to self-righteously shrug his shoulders at the circumstance of English industrial and agricultural workers, or to comfort himself with the optimistic idea that the situation in Germany isn't nearly as bad, I would have to tell him, de te fabula narratur, which is the story is told of you. He's saying this story of England is actually a story about all of us. Because, number 2 here, the basic issue isn't whether the social antagonisms that result from the natural laws of capitalist production are more or less advanced. Rather, it is those very laws, those very tendencies which operate and assert themselves with iron necessity. The country that is more developed with respect to industry merely shows the less developed one what its own future will look like. So when we look at England, we're seeing something about what our own future is. And then I would just sort of say, number 3, he adds a caveat to this, right? He says, on the one hand, when you look at England, you see your own future, you see capitalism and the laws of capitalism playing out. On the other hand, let's set this aside, where capitalist production has truly made itself at home in Germany, for example, in actual factories, conditions are much worse than in England because we don't have the counterweight of the factory laws. And so he's sort of saying, when you look at the real history, right, especially when you look at, Germany, we have basically the emergence of capital fully developed from England. And at the same time, we have the aristocratic society that still exists and is very strong in Germany, hasn't been destroyed by the early bourgeoisie. So you have this sort of even stranger and in many ways even harder way of even harsher capitalism. And in part, it's because the workers haven't had time to organize against this thing that emerged very quickly. So I just want to note, right, real history is not so simple as laws of motion. I don't know if anyone knows this painting here on the bottom left, but it's on the cover of the old edition of Capital. So I'll say for many of us, it's sort of a paradigmatic example of industrial capitalism and Marx. It's actually by this German painter, blanking on the name, sorry, who at the very same time also painted the one above it. it was the very height of German feudal aristocracy at the same time. So this is sort of capturing what Marx is saying. And I just want to, I guess, point out that I think in our modern world, we have that, times 100. Capitalism spread across the whole globe. It's separated different parts of itself. So factories in India look different than factories in other places. Service labor in the US looks different than service labor in other places. We live in this sort of scattered and separated landscape. And so I do think, just taking Marx's own argument here, right? There is a reason to go back to England, where things were starting, where a lot of these laws were sort of appearing at first, where they're a little more coherent. And there is something good about that is sometimes harder to see in the modern world because of how spread out, how much it's brought in all these different things, et cetera. And just to highlight again, right? So we're just saying there's a difference between the model, which is what Marx is going to present to us, and the real behavior, which is what we actually see in history. And so I wanted to just note one of the last things that Marx sort of brings up in the preface is this idea of capitalism as a social organism, which, he brings up the cell, he brings up sort of the scientific investigation of the cell, capitalism as a social organism. And he means by that, right, one, like a sort of an organic living whole, but also something that's conflictual, that has dynamics and processes within it. One thing is fighting against another, it's developing, it's changing. And so trying to understand that about it, and that the economic laws of motion are like something within it, are drives pushing it forward, but it is this broader social organism that we're seeing. And I'll just quickly go back to that headline slide, right? Like a lot of what we see in the headlines are these things that are happening, not in the deep trends of capitalism, but they're part of this social organism that we're trying to understand. And so many of the horrible things we see are clearly related to these economic conditions. And I want to end with just this note about, I already sort of mentioned it, but the importance Marx places on working class organization and power. So this is from around that same section in the preface. In England, you can feel that a process of fundamental change is underway. Once it has reached a certain point, it will have to spread to the continent, i.e. Europe. Whether the forms this process takes as it plays out there are more brutal or humane will depend on how developed the working class has become. And so he is seeing this social organism of capitalism, and the key determinant of whether it's brutal or humane and how it's developing is the organization of the working class within this organism. And he mentions the English factory laws a couple times. And I'll use this as just a brief moment here. This is why, this class is being put on by a socialist organization, why the Democratic Socialists of America is helping put this on, because we are trying to build this organization. We're trying to build up worker unions, tenant unions. And, if you want to be part of that, you should join, or you should find another place to also help, because that's the subject here is the organization of the working class, the development of the working class. Okay, I'm going to move on to chapter 1, section 1, and there will be questions at the end. So if you have some, you can write it down or keep a note, but I am going to just sort of jump into it. That's okay. I can't do it, I think, or maybe I can. Oh. Sorry, everyone. Look at that. Okay, there we go. For those on Zoom, sorry, we had some little funny dialogues. Maybe you were seeing them too on the screen. Thank you all. Okay, just get back to my presentation here. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to note again, we're starting Capital, the new translation. And for this section covering chapter 1, section 1, and really all of chapter 1, I'm going to be following the arguments in the book pretty closely. So I'm going to be basically going through them relatively step by step, skipping some things, etc. That's not going to be true for the rest of the book, but it is going to be true here. He's going to introduce a lot of concepts that you've probably heard before, given that you're in this class. but he is using them in a specific way, and I do think it's helpful for us to try to like understand them from the book itself. It's important to try to get comfortable with them, spend some time with them, and it's okay if it does seem a little overwhelming, if you're like, I don't understand everything right now, or it's not perfectly fitting together, because we are gonna to come back to them again and again, as I noted. So the important thing now is to get a handle on what he means when he's using these terms like use value, exchange value, abstract labor, these sorts of things. And you don't need to worry about, having every little piece covered. So again, I'll just note, right, beginnings are difficult. We're starting by separating the light from the darkness. And the first quote from chapter 1, section 1 is this: the wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. I just want to sort of get down to what that is, right? It's like whether you go to the Costco and you see the enormous accumulation of commodities there, or you go to the Amazon warehouse, you see the enormous accumulation of commodities there. You go to any sort of commercial street, right? When we think of wealth, vast amounts of wealth, it's all the different pieces of it are going to be commodities, right? You're not going to end up with other things. And I know maybe there's a little confusion there. Stocks, bonds, well, ultimately those things do tie back to probably commodities, but we're just focusing on like sort of material wealth that you could sort of imagine holding right now. And in this society, these things are going to be commodities. They're going to be things you buy and sell from companies. Marx then says, that each of these commodities has sort of two characteristics he wants to focus in on. And the first is use value. He says that throughout history, humans have met their needs with useful things. This is something that has always been true. You can go back to the very earliest emergence of humanity. We'll be, using our work to make useful things, and then the useful character of those objects is part of how we live on this earth, right? It's also true today that when we use a computer, it's the useful character of it that ultimately is its use value, and it comes from an object's material properties. So whether it's the computer that you could pull out of that Costco warehouse, it's the incredibly complex organization of all the chips and things which none of us here understand, and probably no person perfectly understands, that makes it useful to do all sorts of crazy things like set up this Zoom call and do a variety of things like that. To take maybe a little bit of a simpler example, right? It's the jug, used even well before capitalism, right? It's the jug is useful because it can hold water, because we can use it to pour, because it has a good handle, because it's aesthetically pleasing. All of these things are things that come from its material properties. It's the color of its substance, it's its shape, it's its durability, it's that it has the wood handle, which doesn't get hot. It's all these variety of material properties that makes it useful for us. And so that's the use value of any object and of any commodity. On the other side, Marx talks about exchange value. And basically when he's talking about exchange value, he's asking, why can all these various commodities be fairly traded with each other? And so, it's something I'll just say, we don't really live in a world where we trade commodities with each other very often. I think that was a little more present back in Marx's time. But in other words, these things are worth the same amount of money. If you did trade them, it wouldn't be unfair, right? This is still something that's pretty present in our consciousness. If I had a MacBook and I went into, a store or something, I was like, I'll trade you this for 250 gallons of milk, and then I got it, that would be a fair trade. In terms of use value, it might be a little silly, because what am I going to do with 250 gallons of milk, right? Unless I have an army or a class or something. But it would be a relatively fair trade, or, again, to make it as literal as I can be, these things are worth about the same amount of money. If you then take that gallons of milk and you're like, oh God, I don't know why I did this. You go to another place, you're like, I'll trade you for mascara tubes, and you get 120 drugstore mascara tubes. Again, it's a good trade. It's fair. Those things are worth about the same amount. Again, unless you got a lot of eyes, you probably have too much mascara. But it is a fair trade that we can make, sort of. And it's something that when you think about it, all these commodities are sort of, we're thinking about them this way. I could get this or I could get that, right? There's this sort of exchangeability of commodities. And Marx does start by saying this sort of MacBook to milk to mascara, and then, let's say there's a bird flu crisis and eggs go up twice in price, and now suddenly things are changing. It sure seems random, this sort of exchanges between all these various commodities. But when you think about it, there is an underlying consistency to the way all these commodities are relating to one another. And so this is one of his first questions, right? Is what is the real basis for this sort of daily fact of exchangeability, of equality between commodities? There's a couple ways to sort of maybe to tackle this, but I'll say one of them, right, is like when you take the MacBook and you say it's equal to 250 gallons of milk, sorry. You take those gallons of milk and you say they're equal to 120 drugstore mascara tubes. Well, then the MacBook is also equal to the mascara tubes, right? There's a consistency. A equals B, B equals C, thus A equals C. That is true for this. Another way of sort of just thinking about this idea of the consistency is, I find this maybe useful, is to think of a trade that clearly doesn't make sense. So what if you had a new car and you're like, I'll go trade that for a watermelon or something. It's not going to be a fair trade. And anyone who heard about it or thought about it would be like, that's stupid. Don't do that. So there's a consistency to how these things are being traded. And Marx is saying there is some basis for that, and that this exchange value between commodities reveals a common substance to commodities. And that's what Marx calls their value. And I want to just quickly say too that it's not just that commodities have a value, it's also that there's a certain amount of value in each commodity. There's a magnitude of value. So, I think the image is self-explanatory here, but you could double everything and it still holds, right? There's an amount of value. And so with this, I'm going to take just a little bit of a step back, go back to use value, and say, when we think about use values, we're thinking about an endless number of qualitatively different things, right? So we're thinking about the Febreze, the magazine, the slippers, and these are useful qualitatively different things. You cannot, if instead of the Tide Pod, you put the toilet paper in the washing machine, that's not going to work. It's going to actually do something bad. If instead of the slipper, you try to you try to use a slipper instead of the spoon for cooking, that's not going to be good for the people who are eating over at your place. So these are qualitatively different things with different uses that are just different. And so one of Marx's questions basically is what happens when we take these two qualitatively different things and we put them equal to one another. And I'm going to take an example from sort of another sphere first, which is just having a scale. So let's say you're weighing a loaf of bread. And so on one side, you have an amount of iron. On the other side, you have a loaf of bread. The scale, the equality between these two different things is an expression of a natural property that they have in common, their weight, right? And as weights, when you put them on the scale and say they're equal, you're saying as weights, they're the same. And so this is something that we're also doing when we're in the world of commodities, right? We're taking these two things, we're saying there's a property they have in common, and according to this property, they are the same. But weight, in this case, the weight of the iron or the bread, is a natural property of these things. And natural properties are part of their use value, right? In fact, the iron here is specifically being used because it weighs a certain amount. Exchange value, which is what we're trying to cover, is specifically an abstraction away from all these natural properties, from all the things that make a commodity useful. And so no natural property can be the basis of exchange value. And we'll come back to this quote, but just to read it here. Within this relation, i.e. within exchange value, one use value counts for exactly as much as any other use value given the right proportion, right? So we're abstracting away from use value. And so Marx comes to this equation again. He says, here's a commodity, here's another commodity. One MacBook Air, 250 gallons of milk are equal. What does this equation say? That there's the same amount of a common something existing in both these two different things. Two, these two things are thus equal to a third, to something that in and for itself is neither the one nor the other, each insofar as it is an exchange value, must be reducible to that something. And then the third point here, this common something can't be a geometrical, physical, or chemical property, or any of a commodity's natural properties. The physical properties of commodities matter only insofar as they make commodities useful, and thus into use values. But what characterizes the exchange relation of commodities is clearly that it involves abstracting from their use values. Within this relation, one use value counts for exactly as much as any other, given the right proportion. And so point 4, if we set aside the use value belonging to the physical bodies of commodities, just one quality remains. They are products of human labor. And what Marx, I think, really means here, just because sometimes this trips people up, is that humans had to work to make this thing exist. It doesn't just appear in the Garden of Eden. We just pluck it off by chance because we're walking by, right? The product of labor is something that all these commodities are. They're something that we work to make. But he does then immediately have, again, a caveat, right? But the product of labor, too, has been transformed in our hands. And so this is the next slide here. I'm going to say what happens not just when we equate two commodities, but when we equate the two different types of labor that go into these commodities. So if you think about the gallon of milk, right? There's the dairy farmers, there's the people who are sort of working in the factory processing the milk. There's all sort of packaging, producing the plastic packaging, et cetera. There's the logistics, transporting it in cold storage. There's all sorts of labor that goes into producing this milk of various different types and forms. On the side of the computer, that's even more true. I'm not even going to go through too many, but from mining to assembly to all sorts of different things, right? There's sort of an amazing amount of labors that go into making any one computer. And when we equate these two things, we're also equating all these processes that went into making them, the various types of labor that went into making them, and turning that into sort of some common substance as well. And so what do we get when we abstract from every specific type of labor, from the farming, from the assembly, the factory work, the transportation, and we just say labor, products of human labor? If we abstract from all the various labors that go into each commodity in the modern world, we get, and pardon the AI here, a sum of society's labor, all social labor, as a gelatinous whole, abstract whole, right? So this is part of what Marx is doing here, and he'll sort of back it up in later sections, but he's saying, actually, when you think about this, you have to think about all of society's labor as one whole, a gelatinous abstract whole, of which any piece of labor in any commodity, represents sort of a part of that labor. And so when we equate these different labors, when we equate commodities and thus equate the labors, we're sort of producing this abstract whole of all the labor. Excuse me. And so one commodity thus represents some piece of it, a bare gelatinous blob of undifferentiated human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. And this is value. We've finally gotten to what Marx says value is, right? He says it's a glob of undifferentiated human labor that each commodity bears or holds as a commodity in our society. And so when we go back to this original sort of random slide, right? The exchange values of commodities are ultimately determined by their values, by the amount of this abstract human labor that's embodied in each. And so you can almost imagine, right, each of these commodities having an attachment, almost like an underlying amount of abstract human labor that's part of them, even though it's not naturally part of them, right? You can't find it anywhere. And it's what makes the MacBook Air equal to the gallons of milk, equal to the drugstore mascara tubes. I'm going to say the numbers there just because they do matter in this case, right? It just makes the one MacBook Air equal to the 250 gallons of milk, equal to the 120 drugstore mascara tubes. And so each commodity's value is this underlying social, not material characteristic that it has in capitalist society and which undergirds the way all these things can exchange. And so just to sort of come back to this big picture, right? If we take that computer, The computer is just one part of the world of all the commodities we as a society produce. Let's say in a year, right? We produce all these commodities. The computer is one little piece. And it also is one piece of all the social labor that goes into those commodities. And specifically, as a piece of this social labor, right? It's not the amount of hours you put into making milk, right? If you go out and make your own milk and take 5 days to do it and buy a whole cow and it takes all this time, that doesn't make it worth a lot of money because it's the socially necessary labor time. It's the milk as a part of social labor, as an average part. And so this is sort of how he's thinking about values. Like every commodity represents an average part of our total social labor. And that's the socially necessary labor time. I'm going to come back to that again in a second. But one of the things that Marx sort of points out pretty quick once we get to this idea is the way that this sort of doesn't exactly mesh with our idea of productivity. There's sort of this funny relationship where value and productivity are inversely tied one to the other. So to give a concrete example, right, if you go back to the 1600s when wheat was generally farmed by hand, it had more value. More human labor was embodied in a bushel of wheat. And I did do a quick little, historical calculation, looked up, and it would be about, in today's dollars, $75 for a bushel of wheat in the 1600s. You go to today, that wheat is farmed in industrial methods, using highly productive labor, etc. And each bushel has much less value. Now, if you go, wheat normally trades about $7 a bushel. So 1/10 the amount of value, the amount of human labor is embodied in this wheat. And that's because the productivity has increased. So the productivity has increased, the value has gone down. And why is that? It's because productivity is really related to use values, right? It's the amount of use values that you can produce in a given time. So if in this old method, you produce in 1 hour 1 bushel of wheat, now that bushel of wheat represents the whole hour, the 60 minutes of labor. In the new method, if you produce in 1 hour 12 bushels of wheat, well, you're more productive, you've made more use values, but each of those use values now only represents 5 minutes of labor. And so this is the inverse relationship between productivity and value. And I'll go through it just one more sort of scenario. Like let's come fully into the present. And let's say that, which is true, right? We have in this modern world some peasants who are still farming wheat by hand. That's still something that happens. Well, because it's the socially necessary labor that counts, because these commodities, wheat, it only counts as an average of its type, right? You can't say my wheat's special and different than his wheat. They're all pretty much wheat. Even though these two producers use different techniques and the different amounts of labor are needed, they're ultimately producing the same bulk commodity, the bushels of wheat, and that commodity is ultimately being traded on global commodity markets today at about $7 a bushel. And so these commodity markets are determining this price, and generally it reflects this socially necessary labor time, which is, the industrial method of farming. And this actually, there's a million stories that can sort of be explained by this, right? Which is in many parts the way peasantries across the world have been sort of decimated throughout the history of capitalism because their labor doesn't count, right? They can work 12 hours doing farming of various types of things. Well, the socially necessary labor embodied there is only 2 hours, and they have to live off that. And so this dynamic actually, explains a lot about some of the things we've seen in the world in the last 100 years of history. This socially necessary labor. I did want to briefly jump ahead because we see this. I've seen this a lot of times come up in this chapter 1 section, which is jumping ahead briefly to volume 3. Okay. In volume 3, Marx gets into what today is often called more classical economics. He gets into markets and competition and how firms behave and a lot of these things that actually I feel like a lot of us today, I mean, I don't know, probably not everyone, but a lot of us, we did learn that in high school even, or sometimes in college. So just keep in mind, he's not thinking of an audience that knows all those things in the beginning. He covers them at the end. But he does say actually that it's the competition, it's this sort of broader market dynamics that ultimately bring these economic laws of motion into being, or are part of them, underlie them. And so to give an example right here, if a commodity is selling at a high price above its value, other firms recognize that there's money to be made there. There's an opportunity for profit. They're going to produce more of the commodity. They're going to invest, and the price is going to go down. On the other hand, if a commodity is selling at a low price below its value, firms are going to go out of business or reduce production. They're going to produce less. And with this scarcity, eventually the price will go up. So there's this sort of oscillation around price, around value. And I'll just quickly note, although I could go on a whole crazy tangent here, that this dynamic I just presented is supercharged by 1,000 times when gigantic financial institutions that can throw around $100 billion like it's nothing come in and start basically trying to make bets and anticipate these various things. So this sort of competition, which Marx does cover and think about in Volume 3, is something he's thinking about as undergirding these sort of laws that we're developing in this first novel. First book. But we are trying in this book, I think, to basically cover the fundamental laws, like the laws of motion, the abstract principles that are determining a lot of these things, not how they appear when capitalist firms relate. That's for later. And so we're almost at the end here. I did have one last slide that's also a little bit about things that often show up when we first start talking about chapter 1. And Marx actually does bring up these caveats too in chapter 1, section 1. But I'll start with a broad one, which is that, remember, we're trying to understand the book, not prove it wrong. So there is definitely a time to be like, what do I think about this? Is it right? Is it wrong? I have this different view. But there's a first time, which is really, I think, where we should be for most of these different sessions, where we're trying to just understand, do I get what Marx is saying? Can I explain it back? Do I have this understanding? And then he does have these other sort of caveats that often come up. One, how do we think about use value, something that doesn't have a use value and value? So what if a child makes a mud pie? Does that have value, even though they put labor into it? Why or why not? Similarly, like what if you're making a commodity, but it's not for exchange? Would a dinner you make for your family have value? Why or why not? And then another one often is these sort of objects that we see, like a piece of art, a piece of land sells for a lot of money. You're like, why do these pieces of art or these plots of land have value? Do they fit in this theory that we've seen so far? And I think, the answer is right. They're not like the bushel of wheat. They can't be made quite as easily. They're not quite as same among all the different types. Not every painting is the same. And so they don't perfectly fit in, but they do obviously relate to it. And so we are definitely going to come back to land closer to the end of this book. And that actually is the end of chapter 1, section 1. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's next, and then we're going to take questions. So this was the first lecture. We'll do another one in about a month that will also cover chapter 1, but cover the last 3 sections. Dual character of labor, value form, and fetishism. Which are great sections. If you've signed up for the class, you should have been placed into a group in a WhatsApp chat or something like that. If you haven't, you can come talk to me. You can talk to Molly in the back there, and we'll try to sort things out for you. Your group should be planning a first meeting in the coming week. If that's not happening, it is up to you. These groups are self-organizing. We're not going to be controlling it. So speak up, be like, hey, when are we meeting? What are we doing? That's, that is your prerogative. And then I just want to say, I'm really looking forward to reading Capital with everyone. It's going to be fun. And it is going to be 9 months. So great. Okay. I'm going to just take any questions and we can go back to slides or anything like that. You can raise your hand, or you're watching Zoom. Is that right, Max? Okay. Yeah. I think we're going to have to... Oh, actually, why don't you say the question and I'll repeat it for Zoom. I think that's what he said. Yeah.
whether it's like more gentle or more brutal depends on the development of the working class. The next sentence on that page says, like, the ruling class uses the laws to wipe away anything that hinders the development of the working class, which seems intuitively true. And I also believe the prior sentence, which seems kind of intuitively true. But I guess I just want to make sure that I understand why they're both true and why, like, the ruling class is making it less brutal. Is that the implication?
Yeah. I think in a sense, yes. And for the Zoom people, Ian was asking about this slide and the sentence that comes after this quote. So if you've read ahead, you know, he talks about how basically this is why the ruling class should help wipe away laws and allow the working class to organize. And I think, I mean, I am no expert on this, to be honest, but I think it relates to the historical period he was writing in, when it was really sort of like many of the historical dynamics were active, emergent bourgeoisie allied with the working class against sort of feudal and aristocratic systems. And so this idea that the bourgeoisie should turn to the working class to wipe away these old things and allow capitalism to develop in this more humane way, rather than allying with the feudal aristocracy, which does happen, right, in many parts of the globe, is basically the feudal or past forms of power basically become capitalists. They just sort of transition. But I would say it's sort of a historical specificity is maybe the easy answer. And the hard answer is that I probably don't know enough to tell you precisely, but it has something to do with this idea that there was this potential alliance at that time, which I'll say I'm a little more skeptical of these days. Any other questions?
We can try with the link.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I don't know. I'm going to do this. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for your lecture. This might be jumping ahead just a little bit, so feel free to ignore. But your slide where you reference volume 3, something that I struggle with, which, you know, in thinking about what value is exactly, you know, you reference that commodity is selling at a high price above its value or a low price below its value. And something I struggle with is, like, what is the relationship between value and price, and how can a price be disconnected from its value in the market?
Yeah. I think the easy answer is it is getting a little ahead. And I would say the important thing to do first, is just try to make sure you're understanding these concepts, which is good. But I will give you an answer, which I actually don't think is coming up in that too far of a time, which is that Marx thinks of value like these economic laws, more like things that are like, you know, you can think of gravity, right? Like gravity is something that happens. All these planets are flying around the sun because of gravity. None of them is like in the place of gravity. So value and price relate a little bit like that, I would say. And I think he has a couple moments coming up soon where he sort of talks about this, that like price is oscillating up and down around, and it's that whole dynamic that is explained by value. But he doesn't really bring up price until volume 3. So don't get too deep in it, because in volume 3 there's a whole section on price and prices and how they emerge.
So value here for Marx is mass.
It's not a bad analogy, right? And say I used weight in that one slide, and mass might be better, but it's like in the gravity analogy, value is like mass and the underlying laws of gravity. And price is the oscillations that occur because of these laws at any point.
So you're trying to explain what Marx is saying about the difference between exchange value and use value.
Yes, great question. So sorry for those on Zoom. The question is, can you just sum up again the difference between an exchange value and a use value? And I will say there's a variety of ways to think about it, but use values It's the way an object is useful to us. It's transhistorical. It goes all the way beyond things. So it's like, right, the shape, the material property of the jug makes it useful for holding liquid. It's like wine or water. And it's a qualitative thing. Every commodity has different qualities, different natural properties and qualities that make it useful because of how it's made. Exchange value is quantitative, right? In fact, any of the different qualities that we've talked about, any of them could work as long as they're in the right proportion. So it's indicating this underlying substance or a quality between all the commodities that has a quantitative dimension, right? You can have one MacBook or two MacBooks or three MacBooks, but in the end, the MacBook and the milk and the mascara tubes, they're all part of this same, they're all able to be equal with one another. So exchange value is this like exchangeability, the way commodities can exchange one with the other. And it sort of gets away from quality and gets to quantity. Does that help? Or is it still, maybe I just made it more confusing.
We tried to tie them both into just the concept of value without either term. How?
Yeah. So I would say it's slightly different, although that's not wrong. It's use value, he's saying, is like always there, even before capitalism, right? And then exchange value is what we start with and what we see when we think about how commodities relate. And value is what underlies exchange value. So value is underlying exchange value. And in its sense, it's like, it's the true thing that's being expressed when you see exchange value. In the next slide, we'll sort of go into what he says is the opposite, where it's like, then we'll go and say, how is exchange value and ultimately money the necessary mode of expression of this thing I've called value? But so to say it again, use value is on one side. It's like an always true thing about we need useful things. That's how we live as humans in the world, by, creating useful objects with their qualities, like a jug, like the computer. Then there's exchange value, the way we've exchanged these things. And underlying exchange value is value. It's what explains why things can all be exchanged. And then there is this point at the end, which is that if you make something, this is that mud pie slide, right? If you make something that has no use value, well, it's also not a social use value. There's no socially necessary labor time, right? It's not socially necessary, and thus it doesn't have value. So there's a tie back. And sorry for making it confusing, but I would say he's not uniting use value and exchange value into value. The simple way of putting it is that value sort of underlies exchange value.
We got a question from Zoom.
Okay.
Asking Nancy to unmute right now.
Hello,
I think we can hear you.
I'm on. This is Nancy. But she's right next to me. Daniel, I have a quick question. It says, my name's Andrew. So I don't know if you threw this out casually or not, but when you were talking about the jug earlier and about its use value, you talked, of course, about the quality of the hand and its function, what I would call its functionality. But you did, at the end, mention its aesthetic value. And I was a little bit surprised, just because I associate aesthetics sometimes as being maybe a bit apart from its function. So I'm wondering, how does that fit in? Like, I know we could agree perhaps on the functionality and the usefulness of the jug, just like we could probably on the cheese that I think I see there and its kind of nutrient value and all that. But how does the aesthetic pleasure factor in, or does it? Did you throw it out by accident or not?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And hi. So I think it does fit in, and you can read this if you look in, I think it's one of the paragraphs pretty early on. He says, we meet our needs, whether, material, whether of the imagination. He has this idea of needs that's very broad, and we're meeting our needs with things that have sort of various useful qualities. So I think even aesthetic needs, like wanting to live in a place that's beautiful, totally fits into this framework. It is a little harder to think of, I guess you could say, right, why is this jug beautiful to one person, but maybe not beautiful to another? But to take that and move it on the other side, it's the same with the milk, right? It's like you have 250 gallons of milk. Well, that's not actually useful to most people. So any type of use is, in a sense, somewhat individual. You know, it relates to a certain way some person can use a thing. It relates to the qualities of the object. And Marx does define it very broadly, I think, to include aesthetic qualities, even though it's hard to say definitively, like as me, that this jug is the most aesthetic or the least aesthetic.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, when you were talking about, you might just take the mic. Yeah, just wanted to sort of check whether my understanding here, but when you were talking about an increase in efficiency of production, particularly around industrial farming, you mentioned that productivity is tied to an increase in production of use values. And that sort of had me thinking, are we headed towards like defining exchange value as a sort of rate of like labor time per use value, like use value as a unit? Is that like a good way to think about this, or am I going down a wrong track there? Yeah, like, are we looking for a formula for exchange value, basically, here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you're largely on the right track in the sense that Marx talks about use values as being bearers. Is one of the things he uses, like bearers of exchange value. So a bushel of wheat as a use value, like the use value in a sense, I know it actually is hard to understand, I think, and to think through. I found that myself. I think that's very common in groups. But once you get to it, it's like, oh, it's the objecthood of the thing. It's like what it actually is as an object. It's its shape. It's you know, the material, etc. And he's saying these object things do carry this extra thing in capitalism, which is the value. And so in a sense, what we're going to be doing a lot is saying how much of this extra thing, the value or the exchange value, is attached to the object. So I think yes, and then I'll add one extra point, which hopefully is useful and not just confusing. But he does sort of go through two aspects. So if you see actually chapter 1, section 1, the title I think is Value, Substance, Magnitude of Value. And so he tries to divide this into 2 points. And one of them is just that when we make the MacBook computer and the milk equal, regardless of how much of each, we're saying there's a common something to them. So that's the substance. There's like a common substance. And then it's one MacBook and 250 gallons. And so that's the common magnitude. So there's other sort of confusing things that are going on that, I guess I shouldn't say confusing, but there's other things he's doing beyond just saying a use value holds a value. But I think in general, that's the schema, is right. Like this much linen, one coat holds this much value. Why don't you just ask your question, because you're a little far from the mic.
Yeah, sure. I'm just wondering how you would respond to this kind of question. Like, okay, use value, it's useful. If I'm a longshoreman worker, it's useful for me to have a job, obviously. And if the boss produces automation, there's fewer jobs for me, right? So. But obviously there's more containers being moved per hour because now a machine is doing it and it's more efficient. Why doesn't that track? Why do you think that doesn't, that view of, like, is this like a partisan view of, is this the view of capital, what is useful, as opposed to labor? Like, because for the worker, maybe I would prefer to have more jobs, even if I hate my job, better than no job. Than fewer jobs, but more output, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Sorry, I just took a bite of a muffin. The question was about basically getting away from use value as Marx is defining it and saying, well, broadly, what's useful for someone living in the world today? Having a job is useful. And I think that's a fair way to put it. And when we automate, when we do this productivity thing that is covered in this slide, we're maybe making more useful things, but we're taking away what's actually useful, which is the job for the person. And that actually is exactly what Marx is going to use this idea to develop too. So it's a brief preview of chapter 25, but this is the tragedy of capitalism, is that technological improvement leads to suffering for most people. It's a system that produces that by its internal law. And so, good preview. I won't try to explain why that is, because that would probably just be confusing and lead to me spiraling. But yes, there's different ways to think about use. And I think in this case, this is one of these. Like, the reason he's bringing it up again and again in chapter 1 is because it is an important idea that he's going to use to ground a lot of these bigger ideas about, like, why does productivity actually lead to suffering in many ways in a capitalist society.
I do have a question on Zoom. I'm going to ask Cam to unmute.
You hear that, Cam? If you want to unmute.
Yes. So my question is, on one of the first slides when you're equating the 70 things of milk to one MacBook. So can you go to that slide? Okay, thank you so much. So my question is, like, you asked the group and you're like equating like 250 gallons of milk. You're saying generally we'd all like agree that this equals like one MacBook Air. But if we're not like using price to determine that, how are we equating this?
Yeah. I think I get your question, but maybe you can tell me if I'm answering it, and
Okay.
it's helpful. And I think I'll just share this more as a piece of advice, because I think I often have this issue when I'm especially reading through these early chapters. I come to think, I'm like, wait, what? Are we sure about this? Are we how did all the arguments come together to make this? And then we don't have that piece yet. And I think when you find yourself in that place, the best and most helpful thing to do is to just say, Marx is not making like a sophisticated, complex argument where all the pieces are fitting together to prove it. He is actually often just describing things that we see in the world. And so the argument doesn't have to prove it's true. Like the world proves it's true. And Marx is trying to say, well, what do we think based on the fact that in this world, this is true? And so I find that useful. And I think that's sort of how I was trying to present it here. So there isn't like the reason these two things are equal. We're starting actually just from the phenomena that, we all live our lives and we know a MacBook Air, it's about $1,000, 250 gallons of milk, about $1,000,
Right.
these two
But
things
that
are valuable.
inherently like brings up like price though, and like the concept of money, which is like I mean, I feel like that is,
Yeah.
and then we like have to include it in this, right? If we're saying these two things are equal and we all conceptually think they're equal because of price.
Yeah. I guess I'll say, I'll say it in two ways. One, I think what I sort of said still holds. So it's like, we all think they're equal. We don't need to fully explain all the because. This is the power of abstraction. Marx is trying to say, let's step way back. Let's look at this phenomena that we sort of agree on, and then let's make some judgments about like what it means that seems to be true. But I do think, and this is sort of what he's saying. So, the whole of chapter 1 in many ways is organized as an argument for why money and, in a sense, price, he does even mention the price form, is a necessary part of commodity exchange. So he is going to get there actually in chapter 1. But the way he's structuring the argument is more this like, let's start with these two commodities and how they relate. And then let's see how, because commodities need to relate to one another, it's necessary that money and price develop out of that, which is what we see every day, right? Like that's our experience. So hopefully that's helpful, but there's this sort of weird reversal, right? It's like logically or sort of in terms of the argument, he's starting with these basics and developing up to what we experience in daily life. But of course we experience the end result. And so it takes this this sort of power of abstraction, stepping back. So maybe the answer in a sense is just wait and let's see if you still have the same question at the end of chapter 1, because he will get to money and price as sort of the conclusion of this equation, which, they are clearly related.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Wow. Okay, we got a couple. You want to go in the back?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is just like a dodge to that last question, but sometimes I've never read it before, but when I've sort of heard other people talk about value and price, sometimes I'm like, well, could you just, instead of using dollars or pounds, just be like units of value? And then, right, because I mean, inflation happens. I don't know, money used to be gold, and gold would go up or down, right? And so, like, if you just say it's 70 units of value versus 15 units of value, and then figure out that, like, but I don't know, maybe that's the same thing. I don't know whether that's a good distinction or not.
Yeah. Well, the question was, can you just sort of, instead of using price terms, just say like it's this much value? And I do think actually Marx does both. I think in this chapter and throughout the book, he'll say it's this many hours, and then he'll say it's £2.50. And he's switching between all these things. And I don't know if I'm going to make some grand argument for it, but I think, I think he's trying to ground an argument that's a little deeper than you have to pick this way of seeing it to get to the argument. And so that's probably part of the switching, right? Part of the layers is he's trying to sort of, you could say, build something really sturdy. And you don't build something really sturdy by having it depend on like 6 pillars that are all essential. He's just like, well, if you look at it with price, if you look at it with value, if you just put 2 commodities equal to one another, you're going to get to the same sort of answer. Hopefully that's helpful. And I think, do we have 1 more or 2 more questions? Yeah.
It's not so much a question but an observation. It appears like the fundamental concept of the value form, it's basically just like an emergent property that you only see when you look at like many different interactions. It's not.
Yeah.
The reason why it's not like a physical quantity is that because like the value form only arises from like because of like many different like exchanges of goods in society. So in a way, fundamentally it's much more like a general abstraction describing this like chaotic system in a way, because from my like STEM background, it reminds me a lot of like in a way temperature, because for instance when we say an object has a certain amount of temperature, temperature is just like an abstraction, because like what's actually happening on like the atomic scale is that you have like the constituent atoms of the substance are all like vibrating and moving around in all these different directions, and it's like this messy system that's composed of many different interactions. But like when you take a step back and you try to say, okay, what's like when you sum it up over all of these different like movements, how can you describe it? So you have like a property called temperature that's just like the average like kinetic energy of all these like individual atoms. In the same way, the value of an object is basically just something that arises when you average out all of the different like interactions of exchange as this object is like exchanged between different entities in an economy. It's kind of like the same thing, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a good example. I'm going to briefly repeat it for those on Zoom. I don't know if you caught it, but we have a comment here that's basically like the idea of value as this sort of like average of all these messy phenomenon is actually somewhat similar to the idea of temperature from science, right? Where it's like you have a number for the temperature, but it's actually just an average of all these different little atoms oscillating. And I think there's some truth to that. And I will say, for STEM people, Marx uses a lot of these science analogies, which I used a couple, but he'll use. And so he is trying, right, to approach history and approach economy. I think he says, right, I think it's in the preface, or I think it's in the preface. He says, I'm trying to approach it as a part of natural history. So he is trying to approach it with this scientific bent, and I think that will show up. And a lot of those analogies are really useful. But I will just add, there's a second part there, right? Which is he is thinking of it as a science of human societies and social organisms. And so actually, I think maybe this thing is helpful, right? Like there's a difference between physics and the laws, the absolute laws of physics, right? And the laws of natural ecosystems, which are still scientific, but there's a little more mess. There's other things that are going on. You're doing these abstractions. I would say the social, the way Marx is thinking about it is much more on the natural side, maybe even past that, right? He's talking about laws that are undergirding society, but it's not like, force equals mass times acceleration. It's not that hard. It's these sort of broader underlying laws in a very messy, confusing world that is the social human world and history. But yes, I like the analogy of temperature. Thank you. And hopefully that extra tangent was also useful. Any other questions? Okay. We got one more here.
Can you go to the slide with the bushels of wheat, like the 5 minutes versus 60 minutes? Would you also have to account for like the labor that went into constructing the machines?
Yes. Yes. So, yes, especially in this early moment, we are thinking of a commodity as the labor embodied in it is all of the labor that is required to turn nature, right, given by God, in a sense, into the useful thing that we're using. And that, in this case, would include some piece of the machines and et cetera. And we're going to get into that a lot in the rest of the book, right? There's going to be whole sections about the raw materials versus the means of production versus the literal labor that's in the labor process. That's going to be a big part of thinking about those differences. But in this early stage, we're just sort of thinking them as one big blob, the homogeneous, gelatinous blob of labor. Okay, any other questions? And I think we are almost to noon, so maybe we can call it. And thank you all. Maybe you could pause the recording. Thanks everyone from Zoom. Looking forward to this.